What happens when a mighty empire breaks its promises and a nation stands alone against the world? In 1948, Britain turned its back on Israel during their most critical moment. What followed was nothing short of miraculous. Let's explore how everything changed when Israel's destiny collided with divine providence. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, Israel fought for its independence. But the country that once promised to support them, Britain, betrayed their trust. In this video, we'll examine how this betrayal shaped Israel's survival and what it means for the nations today. Through history, we'll explore the moment when Britain withdrew from the Jewish cause, leaving Israel exposed. From the political fallout to the divine intervention that followed, we'll uncover the deep spiritual lessons from this pivotal moment in history. Stay with us. 1. The promise of a Jewish homeland. In 1917, Britain made a monumental promise to the Jewish people through the Balfour Declaration. It was a promise of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This declaration gave the Jewish people a glimmer of hope after centuries of exile, persecution, and displacement. It seemed as though, after all the suffering, there was finally a place for the Jewish people to call home. But as the years went on, this promise would be tested. Britain, which once seemed to honor its commitment to the Jewish people, began to waver. As tensions grew between Jewish and Arab populations in Palestine, Britain's actions increasingly contradicted their words. Despite their pledge in 1917, when Jewish immigrants attempted to enter Palestine, Britain imposed harsh limits and rejected many refugees, even as the horrors of the Holocaust loomed. This divine promise echoes the spiritual significance of the land God promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It highlights the unbreakable covenant that God made with the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration wasn't just a political move. It aligned with God's promises to his people. It was a reflection of God's plan to bring his people back to their ancestral land, as prophesied in the Bible. But Britain's betrayal of this promise shows us how human actions can undermine divine plans, even when God's purpose is still active. When promises are made, especially by those in power, they should be kept. While human beings may fail in their commitments, God's promises remain unshaken. We can take comfort in knowing that even when others fail us, God's plan will unfold, and his promises to us remain secure. 2. Britain's betrayal, the blockade of immigration. During the horrors of World War II, as millions of Jews were being slaughtered in concentration camps, Britain stood as a gatekeeper to their only hope for survival, Palestine. Jewish survivors desperately sought refuge, but instead of opening the doors, Britain chose to enforce strict immigration quotas, turning away those who had managed to escape the Nazi death machines. Even as the Holocaust raged across Europe, Britain's policies toward Jewish refugees grew more restrictive. Ships filled with survivors, men, women, and children, many of whom had lost everything, were turned away at the shores of Palestine. These men and women, who had witnessed unspeakable horrors, were sent back to the very continent where their families were being exterminated. This rejection was more than just a political decision. It was a moral failure. For those in positions of power, it was an opportunity to demonstrate compassion and care for the oppressed, as Christ taught us in Matthew 25:35. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. But Britain, who had once promised to welcome the Jewish people, instead chose to close the gates. This betrayal wasn't just a tragedy for the Jewish people, it was a failure of justice. The rejection of the Jews mirrored what happens when we ignore God's call to help the oppressed. In our own lives, we may face moments where we're called to help those in need. Whether it's welcoming a stranger or standing up for the vulnerable, the story of Britain's betrayal should serve as a cautionary tale for how we treat the oppressed. We should ask ourselves, how do we respond when we're called to help? Do we turn away, or do we open our hearts? The lesson is clear. When we fail to act in line with God's word, we not only harm others but ourselves, as God's call to care for the vulnerable is not one we can ignore. 3. Britain's support of Arab forces and the arms embargo. As Israel's fight for independence in 1948 intensified, Britain's actions stood in stark contrast to the promises it had made to the Jewish people. While the newly formed State of Israel was struggling to survive against 5 invading Arab nations, Britain's policy of neutrality was far from impartial. Rather than offering support to the Jews, Britain actively sided with the Arab forces. One of the most alarming aspects of Britain's involvement was the arms embargo that restricted Jewish access to necessary weaponry. At the same time, Britain was arming the Arab forces, including the Jordanian Arab Legion, which was under British command. The Arab Legion was one of the strongest military units in the region at the time, and Britain played a key role in its strength by providing training, resources, and tactical support. This military support placed the Jewish forces at an overwhelming disadvantage. While the Arabs were well equipped, Israel's fighters had to rely on whatever scraps they could muster: old rifles, homemade grenades, and planes that had seen better days. This situation brings to mind Isaiah 5:20, which warns, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness." Britain's support of Arab forces while simultaneously disarming the Jews wasn't just a political decision, it was an act of moral blindness. Their support for the Arab side, while their neutrality towards Israel led to a perilous situation, mirrored the biblical warning about the dangers of turning away from righteousness. When we look at this moment in history, we must ask ourselves, how often do we compromise on our beliefs for the sake of convenience or appeasement? Britain's failure to uphold its commitments to Israel had far-reaching consequences. It serves as a reminder that standing firm in our faith and convictions is not just a matter of political expediency, but of moral integrity. Even in our personal lives, we must ensure that we are not swayed by the pressures around us, but stand firmly for what is just and right according to God's word. The lesson here is clear. Compromising on righteousness and siding with what is wrong leads to negative outcomes. When we act according to God's will and truth, we align ourselves with His power and protection, just as Israel, against all odds, stood its ground and triumphed. 4. The Exodus 1947 and the British blockade. In 1947, a ship called the Exodus became a symbol of Jewish perseverance and the tragic irony of Britain's policies. The Exodus was filled with over 4,500 Holocaust survivors, many of whom had been tortured by the horrors of the Nazi regime. They had endured unimaginable suffering, and now they sought to make their way to the land that had been promised to them, the land of Israel. The ship was their final hope, their chance at survival, and their desire to return home after decades of exile. However, what should have been a story of salvation turned into one of rejection and betrayal. As the Exodus neared the shores of Palestine, the British Navy intercepted the ship. Britain had enforced strict immigration limits on the Jews trying to enter the land, and despite the fact that these passengers were survivors of the Holocaust, the British stopped them from landing. Not only did they prevent them from entering, but they also sent them back to Europe, back to the very places where they had faced genocide. This moment was reminiscent of the Israelites' own history. The Exodus was not just the name of the ship, it was a reminder of the biblical Exodus, when Moses led the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage, and God commanded them to be free. But instead of finding freedom, the survivors of the Exodus were once again met with resistance, rejection, and cruelty. The tragedy of this situation reflects a deep betrayal, not only politically but morally. Just as in the past, the Jewish people faced obstacles to their deliverance, this time at the hands of a nation that had once promised to protect them. This moment echoes the words of Exodus 14:13-14, which say, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Though the British turned their back on the Jewish people, they were not alone. God had not abandoned them. His promise to deliver them was still alive, and His hand was moving even through the cruelty they were facing. Despite this heartbreaking chapter, God's plan was still unfolding. In our own lives, we may encounter situations where we face rejection, resistance, or outright betrayal. Just like the survivors of the Exodus, we may feel trapped with no way forward. But God's promises do not fail. He is the God who parts seas, who makes a way when there seems to be no way. The Exodus story is a reminder to us all. No matter the obstacles we face, we must stand firm, trust in God's deliverance, and never lose sight of the hope He provides. Even when the world seems to turn against us, God's plan for us will never be thwarted. 5. The War of Independence begins. May 14, 1948, was a day that would change the world forever. After nearly 2,000 years of exile and persecution, Israel declared its independence. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Jewish community in Palestine, read the declaration aloud in Tel Aviv, and with it, the dream of a Jewish homeland that had been kindled by countless generations became a reality. But this moment of joy was short-lived. As soon as the declaration was made, 5 neighboring Arab nations, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan, launched a coordinated attack on Israel. They had tanks, planes, and an organized military force. Israel, on the other hand, had barely anything. The newly declared state had no tanks, almost no planes, and no formal military. The few soldiers that had volunteered were mostly civilians, many of whom had only recently survived the horrors of the Holocaust. The odds seemed insurmountable. Experts around the world predicted that Israel wouldn't last a week. Some feared that the world would witness another genocide, this time of the Jewish people, even after the Holocaust. Israel was alone, unarmed, and surrounded by hostile forces. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, Israel didn't surrender. It fought back. And against all expectations, Israel survived, and not only survived, but began to thrive in the most miraculous way. The miracle wasn't in superior weapons or numbers, it was in the heart and determination of the Israeli people. Armed with little more than homemade weapons, smuggled arms, and a fierce will to survive, Israel's forces defended their land, street by street, village by village. Mothers became couriers, delivering supplies under fire. Farmers turned into fighters, using their knowledge of the land to outmaneuver the enemy. And refugees from all over the world volunteered to take part in the struggle. One of the most defining moments came in the battle for Jerusalem. Arab forces tried to cut the city off from the rest of Israel, hoping to starve it into submission. Roads were blocked, food and water were running out. But against all odds, the Israelis managed to carve a rough, dangerous path through the hills of the region under fire to create what became known as the Burma Road. This lifeline kept Jerusalem supplied with food and ammunition, and its survival was a symbol of Israel's unyielding spirit. Despite the heavy losses, Israel's resolve only strengthened. Families lost homes, and thousands of lives were lost in the brutal conflict. But Israel's resolve did not break. And while the Jewish state had limited resources and was outgunned, it possessed something greater, the will to survive and the belief in the divine promises of God. In Psalm 121:8, we are reminded, "The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore." Israel's victory was not just a military triumph. It was a divine testament to God's faithfulness to His promises. He watched over the tiny nation, and in the face of overwhelming odds, He provided strength, guidance, and victory. For the Jewish people, this was more than a battle for land. It was a battle for survival, for the preservation of their faith, and for the fulfillment of God's plan. Just as God had delivered His people in the past, He was now delivering them again. The War of Independence was the first chapter in a long and tumultuous journey, but Israel's survival served as a reminder to the world that God's promises endure through the most difficult of times. This battle marked the beginning of a new chapter for Israel, a chapter that would see the rebirth of the Jewish state against all odds, driven by the belief that, no matter the challenges, God was with them. 6. The aftermath: Israel's victory and Britain's decline. The year 1949 marked the end of the War of Independence, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's history. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, despite facing an enemy coalition of 5 Arab nations, Israel emerged victorious. The nation, which had been born out of the ashes of the Holocaust and had only just declared its independence, stood its ground. Against all odds, Israel had not only survived, it had secured its place in the world. The cost was high. Over 6,000 Israeli lives were lost, an immense sacrifice for a country of just over 600,000 people. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, and families had lost their homes and loved ones. But what was born out of this sacrifice was something far more profound than military victory. It was the fulfillment of a promise, a divine promise that had been made thousands of years ago to the patriarchs of Israel. God had promised that he would bring his people back to their ancestral homeland, and the events of 1948 were a tangible reminder that God keeps his promises. Meanwhile, as Israel began to rebuild and thrive, another empire that had once been a dominant world power was slowly beginning to fade from the global stage. The British Empire, which had ruled over vast territories for centuries, was losing its grip on its colonies. In 1947, India gained independence, followed by several other nations in Africa and the Caribbean. By the 1970s, the empire that once stretched across the globe had diminished significantly. The decline of the British Empire, particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War, was a consequence of many factors: economic strain, war fatigue, and the rise of independence movements in the colonies. But for those with eyes to see, there was a deeper layer to this collapse. Britain had turned its back on Israel at a critical moment in history. It had promised to support the Jewish people, and yet, when they needed Britain the most, Britain failed them. It blocked immigration, imposed arms embargoes, and left the Jewish people to fight alone. The fall of the British Empire came in stark contrast to the rise of Israel. As Israel's military strength grew and its economy developed, Britain's global influence dwindled. Israel, a tiny nation surrounded by enemies, was thriving, while Britain, once a world power, was losing its colonies and influence. In Genesis 12:3, God declares, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse." This divine principle is still at work in the world today. The nations that have stood with Israel have been blessed, while those that have stood against Israel have faced consequences. Britain's betrayal of Israel in 1948 is a powerful reminder of this truth. Israel's victory in 1948 was not just a military success. It was a fulfillment of God's divine plan for his people. It was a moment in history that showed the world that God's promises cannot be thwarted. As the Jewish state rose from the ashes of war, it became a living testimony of God's faithfulness. The decline of the British Empire serves as a powerful reminder of the spiritual consequences of turning away from God's promises. As Israel continued to thrive, it became a symbol of divine intervention and protection, while Britain, once a great empire, saw its power fade. This contrast serves as a reminder that God's will is supreme, and when nations align themselves with his plans, they will be blessed. Conversely, when they oppose his will, they will face consequences. 7. Israel thrives, a miracle in motion. After the dust settled from the 1948 War of Independence, Israel was left to rebuild from the ground up. The cost of the war had been immense, but despite the devastation, Israel's resilience would not only ensure its survival, it would set the stage for a remarkable transformation. In the years following its victory, Israel faced many challenges. The country was surrounded by hostile neighbors, the economy was fragile, and the influx of new immigrants, many of whom were Holocaust survivors, placed a tremendous strain on the nation. But the people of Israel, united by hope and a shared vision, turned what seemed like an impossible situation into a thriving nation. One of the most significant miracles was the transformation of the land itself. Israel, which had been barren and dry, began to bloom with innovative farming techniques. The introduction of drip irrigation helped revolutionize agriculture, making it possible to grow crops in the desert. The once inhospitable land was now becoming productive, feeding the people of Israel and inspiring countries around the world. What had been an arid wasteland was now a testament to human ingenuity and divine blessing. The revival of Hebrew as a spoken language was another miracle. Once primarily used in religious contexts, Hebrew became the language of everyday life. It was taught in schools, spoken in homes, and even used in the fields of science and technology. Israel had revived not just a language but a culture that had been in exile for almost 2 millennia. The people of Israel were not only rebuilding their homes but also reclaiming their heritage. As the decades passed, Israel's military strength grew. The country became known for its cutting-edge defense technology and innovative strategies. Despite being surrounded by enemies and facing constant threats, Israel's military prowess allowed it to survive and thrive. In the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel stunned the world by defeating several Arab nations and securing vital territories, including Jerusalem. The victory was not just a military achievement. It was a testament to the divine providence that had guided Israel's survival. But Israel's success wasn't just in the battlefield. The country became a leader in medicine, technology, and agriculture. Israeli companies pioneered life-saving medical technologies, while Israel's innovations in agriculture have helped countries around the world combat hunger and drought. In the tech world, Israel has become a global leader, with companies creating products and software used in phones, computers, hospitals, and defense systems worldwide. Despite the constant threats from neighboring countries, Israel continues to thrive. The rockets fired from Gaza, the hostile rhetoric from Iran, and the political pressure from international bodies have not stopped Israel from growing and prospering. In fact, each challenge seems to make Israel stronger. It's as if every attack is met with a greater determination to succeed, to grow, and to continue fulfilling its divine purpose. Many people look at Israel's survival and wonder how it's possible. Some attribute it to strategy, others to luck. But for many believers, it is clear: Israel's success is a miracle in motion. It is the fulfillment of God's promise to His people, a living testimony that the God of Israel is still active in the world today. The continued growth and success of Israel serve as a reminder to all nations of God's faithfulness. Despite the challenges, the threats, and the obstacles, Israel has remained steadfast. God has not abandoned His people. His promises are still alive, and His protection is evident. Israel's thriving existence in the face of so much adversity proves that God's hand is on the nation, and His plan for Israel will never be thwarted. Just as Israel has flourished against the odds, so too can we trust in God's ability to bring life, growth, and prosperity to every area of our lives. When we walk in faith, trusting in His promises, we too can experience miracles and blessings even in the most challenging circumstances. Conclusion. As we reflect on the incredible journey of Israel, from the betrayal it faced to its miraculous survival and growth, it becomes clear that the story of Israel is not just a tale of politics or military strategy. It's a profound testament to the faithfulness of God and the power of divine providence. When Britain turned its back on Israel in 1948, it seemed as though the Jewish people were doomed to face annihilation. Yet against all odds, Israel survived. From almost nothing, it rose to become a thriving nation, a global leader in technology, medicine, and agriculture, all while under constant threat from its neighbors. This miraculous transformation is a clear demonstration that God keeps His promises, no matter how dire the circumstances. Israel's resilience teaches us a powerful lesson. When we align ourselves with God's will, we are part of something greater than ourselves. God's promises are unbreakable, and He is always faithful to those who trust in Him. Just as Israel overcame impossible odds, so too can we find hope and strength in our own lives, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. The story of Israel is a living testimony that no matter how many times nations or powers fall, God's plan will ultimately prevail. The survival of Israel is not a mere political success. It is a divine affirmation of God's covenant, a reminder to all of us that when we stand with Israel, we are standing with the God who never breaks his word. As you go through your own struggles and challenges, remember Israel's story. Trust in God's promises, knowing that just like Israel, you can stand firm in his strength and see his victory unfold in your life. Whether in moments of darkness or uncertainty, God is faithful and his plans will always come to fruition. What do you think about the role of divine providence in the survival and success of Israel? How does this story inspire you in your own life? Let's continue this conversation in the comments below. And if this video resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to stay updated with more thought-provoking content about the powerful stories of faith and history.